Good morning, class, and welcome to our last class session together. This will be virtual, obviously, and if we were in person, we would all be mainly having a discussion, sitting around saying goodbye rather than listening to a professor talk. So we don't have that. Actually, our final class session I consider to be your wonderful posts of your videos, of your research papers. So thank you so much for doing that. So I just wanted to wrap up with a few things, some comments, helping you think about the final, as well as I'm going to give you a video of my paper, one of my papers that I'm publishing. So thank you for everything that you did this very short condensed semester in, and you have been uh, patient, you have persevered, and so I'm glad that we've made it through together. Speaking of the election, however you voted, I hope you're going to support your local officials, work with what you've learned as a sociologist to help you challenge and change those disparities. Because a lot of those disparities that we talk about in sociology class and you read about in your context reader are behind this raucous election and help to fuel a lot of anger and a lot of division that's still in our country. Even after the election, some societal challenges are going to be with us. COVID obviously is the biggest of those, and we are still divided over that. There are many people obviously denying that COVID exists. I will basically say that I do not agree with that. I'm sure you realize that COVID is real and we need to be very careful. It is still a mysterious disease that is again ramping up its speed through our cities and through our states and through other countries. Fortunately, there's a vaccine, if not two, on the horizon, so this is really great news. There was a nurse that just spoke up that you may have heard on, I think, CNN, who was interviewed about so many people that she has treated who have COVID and they're on their deathbed and they're still denying that it's COVID. They don't believe it. And they rob themselves of getting to say goodbye even over FaceTime to their family because they think they're going to get over it, that it's just the flu or that it's a hoax. So it's really kind of sad to hear that that is where we are with this disease still. I just got to read Abby's paper, which is about the 1918 pandemic and how disease destabilizes society. So think about that. What kinds of leadership do you lose when there is a pandemic? We've got lawmakers coming down with it. Another North Carolina teacher, unfortunately, just passed away from COVID. So, what is it that disease does that is integral to all of these societal behaviors, institutions, norms, culture? Um, you know, the fact that we could lose leadership actually is something that is potentially destabilizing. This class has been such an interesting group with such a wide range of experience from a couple of you who've studied abroad and done some traveling and all kinds of other rich things that are going on in your lives. So I have enjoyed getting to know you over the discussion boards. I hope the course has been useful in terms of helping you with your writing. I know that if we had a whole semester together, we would get to do more writing and more feedback on your writing. Um, and I hope that the resume writing and cover letter writing was useful to you as well as some of my comments. Please do read through those comments again if you're still working on resumes. Go to some of those websites. Um, ask your professors for reference letters. That's part of our job, so don't be shy about that. And in terms of editing and writing, one of my professors said that when you're applying for a job, one typo will kill you. And so I've kept that in mind, and I want to share that advice with students. So just edit, 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 and ask somebody else to look at it, because we all miss things. So check that out. I think you're all in good shape now that you've gone through this once, but you'll be continuing to write those resumes and add to them. So make sure that you're paying attention to things like that. I appreciate your contribution to the hostile terrain exhibit. If you haven't had a chance to fill out a toe tag, I invite you to still do that. That discussion board is still open. And I also want to uh, remind you to look out, those of you who will still be on campus, look out for the exhibit in the library in in the spring, and maybe you'll find the toe tags that you filled out, actually. And I know this was very hard to do, and I read both your class and my other class, the class Race, Gender, and Class, which was 90 students. A lot of them also filled these out, and a lot of you said the same things, that just how hard it was and how real it became to see the identification of a particular individual who was trying for a better life, and this was how things ended for them. And it really, I think, gives us a connection to those people that your book, Undocumented Politics, writes about. And it helps us think about immigration law, immigration policy, immigration practices. And that's something that's going to certainly change with the new administration, and some of that has already been announced. You might have heard the Biden administration plans to reinstate DACA and to help undocumented youth move toward some kind of path to stay in this country. So there will be some changes. Your final exam questions will be out, I'm anticipating, by tomorrow, and you've already got 2 of them, so you could go ahead and get started on those. One is about leadership and one is about globalization. Um, I'm looking for, in your answers, I'm looking for a lot of details. I like details, okay, so try not to generalize. Looking for strong arguments. I'm looking for excellent writing, so pay attention to all those things I've tried to teach you this semester about transitions between thoughts, between paragraphs, making sure you're not rambling, making sure you're being clear, um, edit for typos. So you've got time to put together a really excellent final exam. So there will be several other questions that I'll add to those, and I will get those to you shortly, hopefully by tomorrow. So I mentioned that I have a paper that I'll tell you about. Uh, Actually, I've got 3 publications coming out, so it's an interesting time. One of them is an article that I wrote with our former graduate student who just graduated last spring, named Jalen Rogers. And our article is basically a literature review. It's in um, a journal called Compass, Sociology Compass, which publishes literature reviews, basically. So it's not original research of ours, but we surveyed the field and what has been written about this. And what this is the relationship between social media and street protests. In particular, how social media has has become a source of public journalism. And so we write about that, and the fact that so many people can be kind of their own journalists in covering protests, in giving some kind of counter narrative to what the mainstream journalists are doing. And that is one of the positives about social media and street protests. We also have some negatives about that, and the way that some of the literature is discussing the kind of surveillance that can be used by corporations, by governments, um, and the way that these social media companies are for-profit companies. So they're not about changing the world, and that is something that you need to think about in terms of, can we depend on this to actually be a strong source of journalism, when in fact news media, the regular news media, is having to close its doors because people are reading news online, and there's not the budget for newspapers or even news magazines that we used to have. So that's one paper. And another one is a book. It's going to be a book on cultural change in Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And this is something that I co-edited with a colleague, a friend in Poland. It is based on a conference that we organized in Poland a few years ago, and it's a cross-disciplinary conference that is about cultural change across all of these various topics. So we had people who write about novelists that were there. There were people who write um, about the arts, people who write about museums, people who are doing research on ethnicity, on the collective memory of the Jewish heritage in Poland. And my contribution is a chapter that I did with another of our former graduate students, Anne Seville, and we analyzed a database that has the wording of all the constitutions in the world. And we chose the 30 constitutions of that region. So these are all countries that used to be either part of the Soviet Union or they were in the Soviet orbit, we say, because they were controlled by the Soviet Union. And those are countries like Poland and Hungary, Yugoslavia. And so we looked at all of those constitutions to see how gender is portrayed. And it was very interesting to see a lot of language about uh, women's place in society, much of it very progressive, because a lot of those countries were trying to become members of the European Union. So they have some pretty liberal uh, ideas in there. But the other reason is that there were feminist activist scholars who were from the United States, for example, and one of them is someone that I know who just passed away, Anne Snitow, at the New School in New York, who said, we're going to help you get gender into your constitutions and women's rights into your constitutions because we still can't get that here in the United States. You probably know the Equal Rights Amendment has never been placed into our Constitution. I almost said it hasn't been passed and ratified. It actually has been passed. It missed ratification by 3 votes back in the 1980s. Recently, it now, with Virginia, has enough votes to ratify it. But the problem is that Congress has to vote to allow a time extension so they can accept those ratifications. So we'll see what happens with that. But back to the book. That book will be coming out in January. And also, I wanted to mention, because several of you have taken courses with Dr. Merrill, that Dr. Merrill and his wife Dindy were at the conference that I'm talking about, and she's an artist, and she gave a wonderful presentation about jewelry art in Ukraine, where she got to live back in the 1990s. So she was not able to contribute to the book, but they were at the conference. And then the paper that I'll tell you a little more about is one that is stimulated, inspired by my dissertation research when I was in the early 1990s in New York City. I was getting my PhD at the New School for Social Research, and I was very interested in the changes, such as I've just talked about in Eastern Europe. However, as there was all of this explosion of excitement over democracy building in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, uh, it it really gave me pause about, are we really, how well are we doing here with democracy in our own country? Are we the right people to be sort of spreading this gospel of democracy, and especially what about the unfinished business of movement to protect an early African American burial site in Lower Manhattan? So if you ever get to go to New York, once all of this is over, check out the New York African Burial Ground. And one of the things that I wrote about is how a building that the federal government was building on that site became controversial because there was an 18th century burial ground that was basically the result of segregation. And the people who were buried there were enslaved, and children of the enslaved, possibly some free blacks as well that were living there, and as well as some Native Americans. And one of the lessons from that was just how deeply entrenched slavery was in New York City and in the North. And that was a shock. So many people in New York, of any race, just said, I had no idea there was slavery here. And so there was a real wake up call, and it ended up becoming something that led to a lot of exhibits and the about slavery in New York. So now people are much more aware of it than they were at that time. I kind of asked myself if there was internet back then, maybe people would have been more aware of it than they were. However, one of the things that I have taken from that is I started teaching sociology at that point and noticed that our sociology textbooks didn't mention anything about slavery in the North. And so over the years, I've had to kind of do my own editing and tell students about it. And so I decided to actually do some research with one of our graduate students, Rachel Lee, and we looked at some textbooks. We didn't look at some textbooks. We methodically analyzed textbooks and compared them in sociology to see what they say about slavery in the North. And I kind of knew what the answer was going to be before we did this, but we decided to do it more methodically. And we have a paper that was accepted after several years of rejections and resubmissions at several different journals. But it's called Missing Colonies in the American Myths of Slavery. Where is the Deep North in Sociology Textbooks? And I want to just tell you where I got that phrase, the Deep North. It came from a filmmaker that I've had the chance to meet. And that filmmaker uh, is, is, is someone who is named Katrina Brown. And she is from Rhode Island. And she found out, to her dismay, that her own ancestors were the country's largest slave trading dynasty, the DeWolf family, if anybody has studied history. And it challenged her own myths of the centrality of the South in slavery. And her documentary, actually, which is in our library, which is called Traces of the Trade, Stories from the Deep North, basically is she and her family come to terms with this, and they actually go over to Africa and find the place where her ancestors captured and enslaved people and brought them over to this country. So I'll briefly just say what we found in our textbooks study. We found that first we looked at introduction to sociology textbooks, the ones you use in your first year class, and found that none of them say anything about slavery in the North. Most of them describe slavery in the South, or at least have an allusion to slavery in the South. So, for example, there will be photos or images, drawings of plantations, and plantations were more southern slavery. Northern slavery was in fishing industries and all kinds of other more northern industries. So the way that the South is this assumed place of slavery comes up in all the textbooks, basically. But also, the North is really left off the hook because Northerners, including Northern ministers, are portrayed as people who are trying to, desperately end slavery, and they are opposed to what's going on in the South. They are the ones with the moral compass, and so that is something that we found across all of these textbooks. And so the next thing we did was to look at race and ethnicity textbooks. So these are the ones that would be used if you take a course in race and ethnicity that are generally used for those courses. So that would be the subfield, what we call the subfield of race and ethnicity. And we found that actually a range, one of the textbooks is primarily just talking about slavery in the South in great detail. And then several do mention slavery in the North, and one textbook. The most recent one, in particular, gives a huge amount of space to, not only discussing the North and slavery, but also the fact that this was a deep, very interconnected system across the Atlantic. So the whole Atlantic world that you might have heard some history professors talk about. Uh, so one of the points that we're trying to make in this is how can this knowledge contribute to public sociology? And one way it can do that is to help students see how slavery was something that had tentacles across society. And so it is systemic in our institutions and not just something that was confined to one region. And that helps us understand racism and how racism has spread out across the country. Its roots were already there. It wasn't something that sprung up, um, out of one particular region. So there's a quote about in here who says, Howard Zinn, you might have heard of this historian. He says the South is not a mutation born by some accident into the normal, lovely American family. It is simply taken the national genes and done the most with them. So think about that. I thought that was a quite poignant quote. And so not only trying to getting students to see how that responsibility for slavery is shared, but also what does this mean for trying to address the problem of racism as something that is a national issue, a national shame, a national problem, rather than a regional problem. So that is the paper. It will be coming out soon. So if anybody wants a copy of it, let me know. And with that, I want to just say some final words of congratulations to those of you who are graduating. I'm not sure exactly how many of you are. I know several are. And good luck to all of you in your next steps after graduation. Jordan Ziegler is going to be graduating and starting our graduate program, his master's program in sociology. So we're looking forward to keeping you here. I hope we keep some more of you as well. Why leave? We're a great department. Stick with us. So with that, have a wonderful holiday season, everyone, and I will be hopefully seeing you at some point in person or in cyberspace. Please stay in touch. Thank you.